Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Claire sat frozen in the dim interrogation room, the fluorescent light flickering above her like a dying heartbeat, as Holden, pale, bruised, trembling from the trauma of everything he'd been dragged through, slowly lifted his head, his eyes still adjusting to the brightness after hours of unconsciousness, and the first words he managed to choke out cut through the silence like a knife sharpened by betrayal itself. "Why, did you kill Audra?" And just like that, Claire felt every ounce of her carefully constructed facade collapse, every secret she'd buried erupting to the surface, because the truth, her truth, was so much darker, messier, and more explosive than anything Holden had braced himself for. So as he pushed himself upright, his breath ragged, his voice breaking, she finally stopped running, stopped pretending, and finally began the confession she had sworn she'd take to her grave, whispering, "Holden, this was a trap. All of it. Everything you saw, everything you think happened, it was never what it looked like." And with those words, the dam burst, sending Holden spiraling in disbelief, his fingers digging into the metal chair as he demanded she explain, and Claire, shaking with the weight of her own choices, began to unravel the nightmare that had led them here, starting with the moment she first realized Audra had been setting her up for months, feeding the Newman family lies, planting rumors, crafting scenes, staging fights, and weaving a web meant to frame Claire as a volatile, unstable danger to everyone around her, and Claire, terrified of being dragged back into the same cycle of being branded a monster, had been trying desperately to gather proof, to expose Audra, to protect herself, but everything escalated the night Audra cornered her at the lake house, forcing a confrontation that spiraled far beyond anything Claire had intended, and Holden, eyes widening, remembered flashes, shouting. Shattered glass, a scream swallowed by the dark, and Claire nodded, holding back tears as she told him Audra had threatened to ruin her, manipulate evidence, even fabricate assaults, that she claimed she'd already planted fake messages, edited audio, created false eyewitness accounts ready to drop to the police at dawn, and Claire, feeling her entire life collapsing under the crushing certainty that no one would believe her, tried to walk away, but Audra grabbed her arm, shoved her, and in the chaos, Claire fell against the table, hitting her head, and blacked out for seconds, seconds that changed everything, because when she opened her eyes, Audra was lying still on the floor, blood pooling beneath her, and Claire panicked, thinking she'd killed her just by trying to defend herself, but before she could call for help, someone else entered the scene, someone Claire had spent weeks sensing but never confirming, the real architect behind the trap, the shadow who had manipulated Audra and used her ego as a weapon. Holden's heartbeat quickened, confusion flickering in his eyes, and Claire exhaled shakily before whispering, "It wasn't me who finished her, someone else was there. Someone who wanted Audra gone as much as they wanted me framed." And then she revealed the part she had been most afraid to say out loud, that the trap was never just for her. Holden had always been part of it, collateral damage or a target, she still didn't know. And the reason he had been knocked unconscious was because he had stumbled into the middle of a carefully staged setup designed to paint Claire as a murderer. And Claire admitted she dragged him out of that room and hid him because she knew the moment the police arrived, they would believe exactly what the scene was meant to tell them, that Claire had snapped and killed Audra in cold blood. Holden's jaw clenched, the betrayal slicing through him like a second heartbeat. But he could feel the truth in her voice, the terror in her words, the desperation she carried like a second skin, and as she continued, she confessed that ever since she started getting close to him, someone had been watching them, photographing them, tracking their conversations, tracking her movements, and she had tried to protect him without ever letting him know, because the moment he knew, he'd become a target too, and she couldn't let that happen, she couldn't let another person suffer because of the shadows chasing her. She explained that after Audra hit the floor, she checked for a pulse, there was one, but faint and fading, and while she was trying to call 911, that shadow figure stepped out, grabbed her phone, and whispered, "Not yet." Let the story play out, and Claire recognized the voice, one she'd heard long ago during the darkest moments of her life, someone who had once manipulated her into doing things she still had nightmares about. Holden tried to speak, but she cut him off, insisting he needed to know everything now that the truth was unraveling, revealing that this mystery figure had spent weeks reconstructing scenes to make Claire look violent, turning minor arguments into staged assaults, creating digital evidence, and feeding Audra just enough power and flattery to keep her involved until the moment she became disposable. Claire said she never intended for any of this to happen. She had confronted Audra only to get her to stop, to admit she was working with someone else, but Audra had no idea she was being used either. She genuinely thought she was manipulating Claire on her own terms, and when she realized she was just a pawn, she panicked, tried to renegotiate, and that's when everything spiraled. Holden felt the pieces sliding into place, forming a picture far more sinister than he had imagined, and he realized Claire had been living in a nightmare engineered by someone with a grudge so deep it had turned into obsession. Claire's voice cracked as she admitted she shouldn't have kept Holden in the dark, that she should have told him from the beginning that she sensed the danger creeping in, the feeling of being watched, the odd texts from blocked numbers, the misplaced items that made her feel like she was losing her mind, but she was convinced if she played along, she could outsmart whoever was targeting her, gather evidence, and once and for all prove she wasn't the villain people kept trying to make her into. Holden leaned back, emotion choking him, because despite everything, despite waking up bruised, terrified, and suspicious, he felt the sincerity radiating off her as she confessed she cared about him so deeply she was willing to risk everything, even his hatred, if it meant keeping him alive. "I didn't kill Audra," Claire said, the words trembling out of her like broken glass. "But someone wanted you to think I did. Someone wanted everyone to think I did." She then explained that the reason Holden woke up alone in that abandoned room was because she had pulled him away right before the shadow figure could strike again, and then she staged the scene to look like Holden had never witnessed anything, hoping the real puppet master would assume he was still unconscious and unaware, giving them a sliver of time to outrun the trap. Holden asked who the shadow figure was, and Claire froze, not because she didn't know, but because saying the name out loud would make the truth irreversible. She finally admitted it was someone connected to Newman Media, someone with the power to manipulate security footage, access digital archives, and erase their tracks with terrifying precision. She didn't name them, not yet, but she told Holden they were still out there, still watching, still waiting for the perfect moment to finish what they started. Holden felt the walls closing in, the weight of the revelation crashing over him like waves of fire, and as Claire reached out to him, her hands trembling, she whispered the words she had been terrified to say, "I'm sorry. I lied to protect you. But now you know everything, everything except the final truth." Holden, breath trembling, whispered back, "What truth?" And Claire's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve as she told him the revelation that would change everything. "The trap didn't start with Audra, it started with us. From the moment we got close, someone decided one of us had to be destroyed." And in that moment, Holden realized this wasn't just a confession, it was the beginning of a war Claire had been fighting alone, and now he was part of it whether he wanted to be or not, because for the first time, he saw her full secret, not the lie she'd been accused of, not the crime she'd been framed for, but the terrifying truth that someone out there had weaponized their connection, turning their lives into pieces on a board where every move was deadly, and the game was far from over. Holden's breath hitched as Claire's final words hung in the air like smoke in a sealed room, suffocating him, swallowing any sense of stability he thought he had left, and as she watched him process the truth, she could see the exact moment his world shifted, the moment he realized everything he had thought was coincidence, paranoia, or misunderstandings had actually been orchestrated with chilling precision, and the shock in his eyes carved into her soul, because this was the part she had tried the hardest to keep him away from, the part that terrified her more than any accusation or threat, the realization that their connection, fragile and complicated and unexpected, had been turned into a weapon long before either of them understood how dangerous it made them. Holden swallowed, a tremor running through him as he leaned back in the metal chair, the cold surface biting into his skin as Claire continued, her voice raw, explaining that the person who manipulated everything didn't just want her framed, they wanted Holden broken, discredited, eliminated in such a way that no one would question it, and that every step she'd taken to protect him had only made her look more guilty while pushing him deeper into the target zone, and Holden, pale and shaken, whispered, "Why me?" And Claire hesitated, knowing the explanation would unravel a history she'd never intended to share, a history drenched in betrayal and unfinished business, and she finally told him that Holden had once unknowingly crossed paths with this shadow figure's plans before, long before Claire was ever dragged into it, and that his sense of justice, his refusal to turn a blind eye, his insistence on telling the truth even when it cost him friendships, alliances, opportunities, that was what made him dangerous, because Holden wasn't someone who could be manipulated or bought, so instead he was someone who had to be removed. The room seemed to shrink around them as she revealed that weeks earlier, before any of this started, before the staged fights, the edited messages, the fake evidence, there were whispers that Holden had discovered something he didn't even fully remember after the attack, something that tied back to the shadow figures. Corruption within Newman Media, a thread that could unravel their entire operation if Holden pulled on it, and Claire confessed that she only learned this because she overheard Audra talking on the phone one night, arguing with someone who kept insisting Holden couldn't be allowed to interfere, and that was when Claire realized this wasn't just about her past, or her reputation, or the smear campaign they'd designed against her. This was about Holden's stubborn morality, his relentless instinct to protect people even when they didn't deserve it, and his ability to see patterns others missed, something that had made him a threat he didn't even realize he was. Holden pressed his palm to his forehead, struggling to piece together the fragments of memories, glimpses of conversations, warnings he didn't take seriously, the strange feeling of being watched weeks before the attack, and Claire went on, telling him that the shadow figure had been crafting a narrative for months, a story in which Claire spiraled, lost control, lashed out, and ultimately killed Audra while Holden, the unlucky witness, suffered a tragic accident that would silence him forever, preserving the perfect story, tying every loose end in a bow soaked in blood and lies. Holden's pulse raced as Claire described how she found him the night of the setup, lying unconscious, dangerously still, a crimson streak trailing from his temple, and for a few agonizing seconds Claire thought she had lost him, thought Holden had already become a casualty of the very trap designed to destroy her, and she admitted she shook him, begged him to wake up, her hands covered in his blood, but when he didn't respond, she made the split-second decision to drag him out of the room before the shadow figure returned to finish the job. As Claire spoke, she ripped open the emotional wounds she'd kept locked away, revealing how she had dragged Holden down the hallway, practically collapsing under his weight, terrified of every sound, convinced that at any moment she would hear footsteps behind her, signaling the end for both of them, and when she finally found the safe room, an old storage space, she barricaded them inside, cleaned his wound as best she could, and hid the blood-stained cloth, having no time to think about what evidence she was leaving behind. Holden felt his stomach twist as he imagined Claire, shaking, terrified, bleeding herself, trying to save him while the world outside continued to twist their lives into a narrative falsely painting her as a murderer. He looked at her now, sitting across from him, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, and he felt something shift inside him, not trust exactly, not forgiveness, but understanding, fragile and flickering like a candle fighting against a storm. Claire continued, revealing that the reason she hadn't run to the police immediately wasn't because she was guilty, but because she knew the second she stepped into the station, the shadow figure, who had connections buried deep within law enforcement and corporate networks, would plant the final pieces of fabricated evidence and close the case before she could utter a word, and Holden, still reeling, asked her who the shadow figure really was, needing a name, needing something tangible to fight back against, but Claire shook her head, tears sliding silently down her face, explaining that naming them now, without proof, would only get them both killed, because this person didn't operate with threats or warnings. They eliminated obstacles with precision, leaving no trace, no suspicion, just grief and confusion, and that the only chance they had was gathering evidence before the shadow figure realized Holden remembered enough to become a threat again. Holden exhaled shakily, processing the idea that his near death wasn't an accident, but a deliberate move in a larger, calculated game, and he asked Claire why she hadn't told him sooner, why she didn't trust him enough to share the danger instead of carrying it alone. And Claire looked shattered as she admitted that she had been afraid he would walk away from her. Afraid he would see her as a magnet for chaos, afraid that the truth would break whatever fragile bond they had built, but more than anything, she was afraid that if she told him, she would be painting a target on his back that couldn't be erased. Holden's expression softened just slightly, the smallest crack in the wall he'd built since waking up, as he murmured that he would have rather known the truth than wake up in the dark with no memory and a world convinced she was a killer, and Claire nodded, whispering that she knew she'd made mistakes, but she couldn't undo them now, she could only move forward. Holden asked her what the next step was, his voice steadying with a new resolve, and Claire exhaled, her gaze sharpening with determination, telling him they needed to go back to the lake house, back to the scene of the setup, back to the place where the truth had been twisted into a weapon, and gather whatever evidence remained before the shadow figure cleaned it all away. Holden tensed, thinking of the danger, the possibility that the shadow figure might be waiting, but Claire assured him she wasn't asking him to go alone, she wasn't asking him to risk everything for her, she was telling him that if they didn't take this chance, then the story would be sealed forever, and Claire Lawson would go down in history as the woman who killed Audra while Holden Bennett met a tragic fate as a witness who didn't survive long enough to testify. Holden clenched his fists, determined not to let that happen, determined not to be a pawn in someone else's narrative ever again, and he told Claire that if they were doing this, they were doing it together, and the way her breath caught at that word, together, reminded Holden that even in the darkest moments, even through secrets and lies and danger, there was something undeniable between them. Claire reached across the table, her fingers trembling as they brushed the back of his hand, and for the first time since waking up, Holden didn't pull away. Instead, he intertwined his fingers with hers, grounding her, grounding himself, and whispered, "We end this. For both of us." And with that vow, the atmosphere shifted, the fear still pulsed like a heartbeat in the background, but now there was something else layered beneath it, a fragile resolve, a stubborn determination, a spark of defiance, and as Claire stood, the weight of everything she'd confessed still heavy on her shoulders, Holden rose with her, feeling that same weight settle onto his own, but no longer fighting it, no longer running from the truth, because now he understood the full secret she'd carried, the danger she'd tried to shield him from, the trap woven around their every move, and he wasn't going to let the shadow figure write the ending of their story. Claire opened the door, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes filled with hope and fear and something unspoken, and Holden stepped into the hallway beside her, ready to face the storm together, unaware that as they walked, a camera hidden in the ceiling shifted its angle, following them, recording every step, sending the live feed to someone watching from the shadows, someone who smirked as they whispered, "Let the game continue." Neither Claire nor Holden knew that every step they took down that silent hallway was being monitored, catalogued, and fed into a system designed to predict their next move with chilling accuracy. They moved with purpose, unaware of the eyes tracking them from a sleek, dimly lit office miles away where the shadow figure sat, fingers steepled, watching the feed with a predator's patience, whispering, "You think you're ahead, but you're exactly where I want you." Claire felt the weight of the truth heavy in her chest as she and Holden reached the stairwell, her pulse thundering as she braced herself for what came next, but Holden placed a steady hand against her lower back, guiding her forward, silently telling her he was with her through whatever came next, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Claire felt something like strength coursing through her instead of dread. Holden's mind raced as he followed her down the stairs, flashes of half-formed memories stabbing at him, Audra's panicked voice, the metallic scent of blood, footsteps that didn't belong to either of them, and he knew the missing pieces would eventually return, each one a potential key to unraveling the truth, but right now he focused only on keeping Claire safe, because seeing her break apart while confessing the truth had ignited something fierce inside him, something protective, something he wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. They reached the exit and stepped into the cool night air, the sky dark and heavy, the entire world seeming to hold its breath as they crossed the parking lot. Claire unlocked Holden's car, her hands trembling as she slid into the passenger seat, knowing that returning to the lake house meant stepping back into the very place her life had nearly been destroyed, but Holden gave her a reassuring nod before turning on the engine, the headlights slicing through the shadows. As they pulled out of the lot, Claire stared out the window, each tree they passed blurring into streaks of darkness, and she whispered, almost too softly for Holden to hear, "I can't let them win. I won't let them write the ending for us," and Holden tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw set as he replied, "They won't. Not as long as I'm still breathing." The words sent a shiver down Claire's spine, not from fear, but from the realization that she wasn't alone anymore, not in this moment, not in this fight. Meanwhile, back in the surveillance room, the shadow figure leaned forward, zooming in on the car as it drove away, a small, amused exhale slipping through their lips as they murmured, "Good, go back to where it began. I've left something for you there." And with a click of a button, they pulled up another camera feed, this one showing the lake house interior, completely cleaned, spotless, empty, except for one thing, a single, blood-red envelope placed dead center on the floorboards, waiting like a venomous invitation. As Claire and Holden drove closer to the truth, closer to the trap's next layer, neither of them realized they were already playing the next move in a game that had been rigged from the start, a game that would demand a price neither of them was prepared to pay.